Welcome to Write Good, the podcast that helps you write good. I'm R.S. Benedict. In this episode, we're talking about writing in a body, writing that fully explores the physicality of its characters. Joining us is sci-fi fantasy writer SL Huang. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
The reason I asked you on is because I noticed that your writing is really physical.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Like, characters really inhabit their bodies, like they feel emotions in their bodies and not just in their heads. And when you're writing these sort of action sequences, you're very aware of characters' physical bodies in a physical space. Does part of that come from your rather unique background as an action hero / stuntwoman?
I would say definitely. Yes, I'm coming out of a background where we were doing this all the time. Every day was, if not working, training and pushing the limits of what the human body can do. And not only that, but coming up with creative ways of choreographing and of storytelling with our bodies.
Right.
But I think one thing you mentioned that I think is one of the most important things I took away, though, from working in movies, is that it's so movies is all about storytelling, just like writing is, right? We're not trying to win a fight, we're trying to tell a story.
Right.
And the one thing that we're taught and that we strive for in that field is we don't really care as much about the blow-by-blows of the fight. Although cool fights are, of course, very cool.
Right.
But what really matters the most is the emotion of it, which is exactly what you were saying. The moments that the character is in trouble and, am I allowed to swear on the podcast?
Absolutely.
Or are we keeping clean? All right. So those sort of oh shit moments is what we call them. Where the character is suddenly in serious trouble and they have that sudden realization that things are not going to go well for them, or that moment where they rally and they come back,
right.
or even the stakes with the other person in the fight. So all of these are actually more important, I would say, than the physicality, but it's part of that. It's part of that whole consciousness and the mindset. And it's emphasized so much when we choreograph for film and television, because that's honestly what makes a fight interesting, what these characters are feeling.
Yeah, just how they're acting out emotions, and you have to do it all physically. I mean, if a character in the middle of an action sequence said oh no, I'm in trouble now, or
exactly.
Oh gosh, I'm not in trouble anymore, I am starting to win, that would just be the worst.
Yeah, and it's so fast, right? Those split-second moments. So I would say that that's really what's helped me the most in becoming, a writer now is having those emotional stakes.
Yeah. And that's awesome. That's really cool that you have that thing to draw on.
Thanks.
I don't think many writers have that. We're a lot of indoor kids.
It is very unusual, yeah.
The reason I wanted to talk about this is that a lot of the time when I'm reading fiction, I kind of get this feeling like the character is written as a brain in a jar. They're this disembodied consciousness that thinks a lot, but doesn't feel anything physically. Mm-hmm. So why do you think that's so common in writing? Because I get that feeling so much.
I think it's just very common, not just in fight scenes, but across writing in general, that sort of not being totally engaged with the environment. Because I think sometimes when we imagine something, it's really actually a hard thing in writing to try to trigger all of those emotional senses in the thing we're imagining. And I think that's especially true if we haven't experienced something. Right?
Oh,
yeah. And I mean, there's the old saw, write what you know, right? Which, right. A lot of us try to write, at least adjacent to our own experiences or to experience things that we're going to write about. But you can't do that 100% of the time, right? Especially science fiction and fantasy writers.
No. I have not been in a laser gun fight.
Exactly. So, and I think this is it's a really hard thing to do that imaginative extrapolating with something that you haven't experienced. And then, the broader physical experiences we have, the more we can sort of fill in and with guesses for that stuff. But it's hard, writing's hard.
Oh, totally. It's hard enough putting yourself in the mind of another person, but putting yourself in the body of another person, especially if they're not a lot like you, it's like, wow.
Yeah, and that brings up another good point, which is that everybody responds differently, right?
Right.
And everybody's slightly aware of different things, especially experience levels. Like, one thing I've done a lot of is firearms, and a lot of writers, it's recommended to them that, like, oh, if you're going to write about a character shooting a gun, you should go and shoot a gun. But one thing that people don't mention is the experience of doing something like that as a beginner is actually very different from the experience of doing it when you're, when it's like second nature to you. So
Right.
even if you have experienced it, those striations will sometimes, give you a completely different experience than your character might be having. And it's quite difficult, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Or just being like an out of shape versus an in shape person.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like you go through the world very, very differently.
Or characters who have a certain disability. Like I've had periods of disability in my life when I was so much more aware of my body and its limitations, and that's a very different experience from when I'm healthy, and just the absence of having to think about that all the time is quite profound.
Yeah, you just do it versus like, oh my God, everything hurts. I'm so tired. My back hurts, my knees. Oh God, I just want to lie down.
Exactly, yeah.
I'm also wondering, too, if part of that comes from the fact that we have so much, like, screen time. Like, so much of our life experience or our perception is filtered through movies, TV, video games, and not so much through, like, actually going outside and horseback riding or sword fighting or whatever.
I don't know. That's a good question, and I don't know the answer to that. I tend to lean towards thinking that it maybe doesn't have as much to do with that, just because I feel so strongly for like what fiction can do for us. Not books, of course, but also really well-written movies and television that make us feel something. And of course, sometimes it might not be realistic, right? Like movies and television teach us the wrong thing all the time.
Right.
But, fiction is also a way of experiencing the world. So, I mean, certainly I think going out and experiencing it, you're going to get the broader depth of experience. But, I don't know that I would fault media for that. But who knows? I could be wrong.
I don't know. The reason I bring this up is just because something that I've noticed in a lot of descriptions, in a lot of contemporary fiction, is that writers focus so much on sight and sound and often like totally ignore the more sort of intimate senses, touch, taste, and smell. And like sight and sound is what you get from movies and video games. And those three things you can't get those from a movie. You just can't get it from visual media.
That's true, yeah.
And it's a problem in action sequences, but it's also, I've found to be a problem in like love scenes.
There's so much in common between action scenes and love scenes, isn't there?
It really is. It's so physical. And a lot of the times I just feel like I'm reading someone's description of an action scene or a sex scene that they watched and not something the characters experienced. Like you're engaging with this person physically fully, and there's nothing on what's he smell like.
And I would say the same thing about intimate scenes is, it's not so much like tab A into slot B, it's like the emotions of it, right, that are important. And I think you're right that those I think you called them the more intimate senses, is that the wording you used? It can really add to those scenes. And I think, I don't know. Maybe you're right that this has to do with us, the way we could sort of consume the world through screens. But I also think it might have to do with that idea we were talking about of extrapolation and guessing, trying to guess what an experience is like. Because I know when I'm trying to sort of imagine, I'm reaching for those easier senses first, maybe.
Right.
And for example, I ride motorcycles, and once I took my bike to Vegas when I really shouldn't have. It was the middle of winter, and I was riding from Los Angeles to Las Vegas, And I checked the weather. It was December, and I checked. I was going for Christmas. I checked the weather in Los Angeles. It was like, really nice out in Los Angeles, of course. Checked the weather in Vegas.
Right.
Totally fine. I neglected to remember that in between Los Angeles and Las Vegas, there are mountains. The whole journey is over mountains.
It gets really cold up in Northern California and places too. Rainy?
Yes, it was one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. The mountains were frigid. I was absolutely freezing.
Yeah.
I was stopping every half hour. And when I was, too far into the journey to turn around, really, for it to make sense, we started getting high winds and like really bad high wind with the type where they're flashing it on the highway signs, like high winds ahead next
shit.
Yeah. Like these, we're talking like 30 to 50 mile per hour winds.
Whoa.
And I was on my motorcycle was not a large motorcycle. I'm not a large human.
No.
And it was blowing me. It was really, really scary. And
oh, God.
the moment where that first started happening, where I could feel myself losing control of the bike in this terrifying way, I tasted in my mouth, like my whole mouth went bitter.
Huh.
Which is not a thing that I would have like imagined if I were just like trying to like picture this in my head without it happening, right? But it was the most, now looking back, that is the strongest sense memory of that moment, of my whole mouth going bitter and like my whole like face and head sort of like melting into that taste. And
wow.
I ended up pulling into a gas station and Googling on my phone how to ride a motorcycle in high winds so I could, not die. And I managed. I was okay. But then I hit, rain and snow and sleet. It was really the worst decision I possibly could have made making that trip. But anyway, the point is that really specific sense memory, I don't think I ever would have thought of that,
No.
But now that that's happened to me in this like terrifying situation, I feel like I've taken that tiny piece and I've put it in my writing in places that aren't like on a motorcycle, because I know that that's a thing that can happen. So I think just the broader experience we have as writers, the more we like push the boundaries of our comfort zone, hopefully not, on a motorcycle in 50 mile per hour winds, no death here, we don't want death, but like the more we can push our comfort zone so that we feel these things in all these different, areas. And then even if we're not writing what we know, we have this like much larger palette of sensory memory to choose from, maybe, or at least that's what works for me, for sure.
This is something I've been wondering about. Do you think some of this might come from the way that if you're kind of middle class and white collar, your body's a little like irrelevant to your job? So you're discouraged from really inhabiting it that much. Like you're a stunt woman, so your body that's such a big focus on your life. Mine, I sit behind a desk for a job. I avoid thinking about my body as much as possible and, go to the gym and that's it. But it's kind of irrelevant to much of my daily life, which is kind of like a weird way of thinking it. But I think that maybe a lot of the way that work is and the way that we make our livings and the way that we spend much of our day might kind of discourage us from feeling like we're really in our bodies.
That's a really interesting question, and I've never really contemplated that before. My first instinct is to say that I don't know that profession or those sorts of distinctions might have as much to do with it as just sort of overall the broadness of the physicality that you're used to. So for example, I've taught a lot of people sword fighting, I've taught a lot of people firearms, I've taught a lot of people different martial arts moves and stunt moves and stuff. And when I'm teaching people who are new at something, who are complete beginners, but they might come from another sport, or they might be like weightlifters, or they might be strong from their profession or something. What I found is that the consciousness of that people have of their physicality has a lot more to do with their experience in activities that have a lot of spatial and variety of body awareness. So for example, dance, teaching dancers to sword fight, I will take a dancer any day over like anybody else. Yeah, because dance just gives people that physical awareness. But like also, martial arts to a degree, not quite as much as dance. People who have been in the military and are very used to being aware of like their body in their surroundings. And some of this correlates to things like different profession distinctions or class distinctions. But I think mainly it's sort of orthogonal to it, and it just sort of depends on the experience that somebody has in life. Like I don't find like if somebody if their profession is very physical but very repetitive, they probably won't be gaining that sort of body consciousness we're talking about.
Right.
Just like somebody sitting at a computer doesn't. But they'll know their own, the physicality that relates to their job, just like a person at a computer will know like what it feels like to sort of their shoulders to get tense and to be like hunched over the screen and stuff. So my first instinct is just that it would be like the more broadness you have experienced is going to be helpful, but I'm not sure whether that would correlate with like different sectors of society or not.
Huh. It's just something I kind of think about, and
sure.
I've also thought of this along, or at least wondered about it along like race or gender or class lines. Like throughout history, there's been this long-running, really kind of gross belief that certain types of people are more spiritual or intellectual, and other types of people, particularly women, working class people, or like marginalized ethnic groups, are physical or almost animalistic beings. And I've seen this reflected in a lot of writing by kind of like upper middle class Anglo white men. Like I've noticed this so much in a lot of that writing that there's very little in terms of physical descriptions or physical awareness of our protagonist, who's usually kind of like a waspy guy. But every female character is like ultra sexualized. And there are also, I've noticed, really detailed kind of objectifying descriptions of especially like black male characters and their muscles. Like in Moby Dick, I have no idea what Ishmael looks like, but like anytime he's talking about Queequeg, it's like it's incredible details of Queequeg and his tattoos on his dark skin and his giant muscles, and Queequeg's biceps rippling when he raises his eel spear or whatever. And I find this. Is this something you kind of notice? I wonder. Like, am I reading too much into this?
I don't think you're reading too much into it. I mean, I think this is a known problem. But I mean, I personally, when I was much younger, I think I maybe did not have the awareness to notice it, and of course as I've gotten to know more about the world, then you cannot unsee it. But I think now I'm quite fortunate in that I don't see a lot of it, but I think that's because of selection bias. The books I'm choosing to read and the authors I'm choosing to read are very aware of not doing these things. So I tend to, I would say I tend to not see it in really, any of the books that I've read recently in, the past 10 years or so, just because the authors I'm reading are I have such faith in them and such trust in them that they're not doing this. And then, and that trust is usually justified. But movies and television, I will say, Hollywood is always behind, every other sector of society in this. And let's talk for a minute about, like, you talked about women being hypersexualized and stuff. Right. I've heard this called online. I'm not coining this term, but the woman in movies who's a spinny killbot, where
a spinny killbot.
Where I've also heard it called like waif foo, where it's this like small, thin Hollywood attractive woman, because most Hollywood actresses, they sort of cast in the same mold, and doing like all these extremely spinny, acrobatic, balletic martial arts moves that basically like mow down a whole lot of dudes. And I think sort of a very classic example of this, which I don't want to criticize it too strongly because I think it fits the character, but Black Widow in the Avengers, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, her style is very much this, where she's constantly like scissoring her legs around guys' necks and spinning around, and I think that's especially true in like Iron Man 2. They got better at it, but it's so common with women to see that sort of very stylized spinny killbot type of fighting. Right. And You also see this with I'm Asian, and you see it a lot with Asian characters where it's the Asian characters are always the sanitized martial artist. They don't get to be in the barroom brawl. And same with women. And I would say in my writing, it was such a conscious choice. In my Cass Russell series, the main character, she's a brawler. She's much more of a like punch people in the face. She's not like doing a backflip into a roundhouse kick kind of thing. And I notice it when they do this with women. I think Agent Carter did this really well, speaking of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but the television show Agent Carter, she was choreographed much more as a brawler, where she was like wailing with punches that you would see in a bar fight rather than these really acrobatic moves. And I think I definitely see a gender divide there. I definitely see a race divide. And right. I think honestly the only reason I don't see it in what I read is just because there are enough books and there are enough people who are doing different things that I can choose not to see it, Yeah,
it's tricky. One of our previous guests was a woman who ran a Twitter account that just collected like that kind of ridiculous, over-the-top, horny writing about women.
Yeah.
It's called like Men Writing Women.
Yeah, I've seen that Twitter account.
Since I've had her on, like I can't stop seeing that. Every single time I just notice it's like, okay, I'm reading Murakami, and everything he writes about is just titties. Yeah. It's just like he's so horny for titties.
I have to admit, I can't read him.
I vaguely know what Tango looks like, but I know the chest size of every female character in 1Q84 or QD84. I don't know how to pronounce it, but I'm like, okay, calm down, buddy.
I tried so hard to read him because it was so highly recommended.
Yeah.
And I couldn't because of the descriptions of women. Exactly why.
Yeah, and every single one, it's just her boobs. She looked at her boobs. He looked at her boobs. Her chest, her shirt showed off her boobs, and I have no idea what like any of the male characters are. It's just, he's large, but that's it. There's not that specificity. And his pants showed off the roundness of his butt cheeks and the bulge of his none of that. It's just like I'm just trying to imagine the male equivalent of it, and it's just I think outside of like gay erotica, you're just not gonna find that, and it's so striking to me.
And we normalize it, right? We normalize that male gaze so that it seems like the default when it really like why should it be?
And I can't stop noticing it, and I guess I feel like, well, if this is a male character who's horny, then like okay, fine, but it's like a female character is doing that too, and it's like, no. Yeah, and unless she's a lesbian.
Yeah, unless she's a lesbian and also very horny. Like, oh, come on. Yeah, I agree. It's so strange to sort of see that as being, like, sort of acceptably within the realm of, like, published writing and, writing that's recognized as good writing in the world when it's so far off base.
Yeah, and it's so interesting how I feel like a lot of it's like taking your own physicality and sort of offloading it or projecting it onto someone else.
Yeah.
Like he's aware of what she looks like, but there's no sense of, okay, what's this doing to him? How's he feeling this?
That's a good point. Yeah.
Like he felt his heart beat faster. He felt himself grow warmer and nothing like that. It's all...
I wonder if this has to do with... They always talk about like... The patriarchy isn't just bad for women, right? It's also bad for men.
Right.
And men are, young boys are very often socialized against, or at least anybody who's raised as a boy in society is generally socialized against showing emotion, showing feelings. So I wonder if that plays into it as well.
And this body awareness, like I think women are really encouraged to like mind your body very carefully, control it, and men, it's just like... I'm supposed to wash my butthole? What? Like, yes. What the fuck?
Oh my God.
Like, do you not know this?
Right now, we have, like, these anecdotal Twitter threads of people who are talking to the men in their lives who didn't realize you're supposed to wash your hands ever. And they're like, wait a minute, is our takeaway that men were just never washing their hands? Which, of course, is, like, terribly gender essentialist, right? Like, but the socialization does happen.
Yeah, like the number of dudes who don't wash their hands after they take a pee, like, I don't know many women who think like, what, am I not supposed to do that? Like, of course you're supposed to do that. A lot of men are like, what? I don't, it's like, yeah, you come on, man.
And I think even with people who are not on the gender binary, it's like we get socialized according to like the way society views us. in such profound ways. And it's so unfortunate. And it affects the way we consume media and the way we create media.
And the way we live with ourselves,
Absolutely.
too. Like, a lot of my friends who are in, like, long-term straight relationships have realized the women a lot of times find themselves having to help the men with basic physical self-care. Like, hun, you're hurt. You need to see this doctor. Or, hun, you're having your muscles are really tense. I'm going to schedule you for a massage. Because, like, men are kind of, I think, trained not to think about that or to see, like, that kind of self-awareness as being, like, feminine or girly
Weakness.
Or vain, as opposed to, like, no, this helps you, this keeps you alive, this is good.
Yeah. And I think, while we're talking about gender and physicality, I'm a genderqueer person, and I have a lot of friends who are trans or non-binary, some stripe of non-binary gender, and
right.
The awareness that comes with, like, navigating that
is the physical awareness
is another thing, and disability also plays into this too, as we've talked about. Like, there are certain axes of identity that really end up giving people an awareness that other people who don't have that, who aren't navigating that identity, maybe don't have.
Right.
And I think that that's also, something that writers can keep in mind. And nobody's a monolith, so it's not like everybody in any demographic is going to feel or think the same way.
Right.
But it's definitely something that I feel like I notice more in my queer communities, that, we have these conversations, and in my communities where we talk about health and disability, that there are conversations that happen there that just don't happen outside of that space, that have to do with our bodies and our awareness of our bodies.
Oh yeah, that's a really good point. Man, I'm just imagining, like, transitioning would bring so much awareness to everything in your body, I would think. So let's talk a little bit about, like, how to get away from this. What are some tools or methods or whatever that writers might use to cultivate a greater sense of physical awareness? Like, maybe certain sports or something? I don't know.
Well, I think really any type of physicality is going to help people. I would say, honestly, variety. Mm-hmm. Just like what we were talking about before. Obviously, if you love a sport, keep doing that sport because you love it.
Yeah.
But I think the more we experience of, like, different types of physicality can really help. For example, I've pulled from experiences of, sword fighting, horseback riding, martial arts, boxing, pistols, riflery, skydiving. Like, all of those things have like contributed more to that, like, palette of sense memory that we were talking about for me. And not all writers write the same way, but that's certainly been helpful to me. And I think any sport is going to give some narrow band of experience, and then the more broadly you're able to sort of expand that. And then some sports like dance or like martial arts, I think, give a greater variety of physicality. Or aerial circus has also been very good for me for that.
Wow.
Yeah, but, like, all of those, pretty much anything you would do. But I think you also need, like, the emotion that we were talking about. So like, if you're just, for example, practicing something in your living room, maybe that doesn't push those emotional boundaries. Like, for example, if you're practicing martial arts, doing sparring is something that, like, has much more heightened emotion than, like, doing a form. I feel like capturing those moments, that's what's so important on the page. Or, for example, swimming. If you're swimming laps in a pool, it's pretty low stress, I think. And I'm not a swimmer. I mean, I can swim, but I wouldn't call myself a swimmer. But I've had an experience of being in the ocean and, having a moment of panic where I couldn't get back to shore. And that, for me, I've used that in writing for sure. That moment of emotion where I was like, I can swim, I'm doing, but this physicality is totally different. Again, not advocating, like, putting your life at risk, but the more like experiences we have. For example, last time I sparred my teacher in my Taekwondo class, there was this one moment where I thought I saw an opening and I tried to rush her, and she spun and she kicked me so hard. I was wearing a chest protector, but I was, for basically like a full minute or like 3 minutes, I was just trying to breathe. Like, it was so bad.
Wow.
Like it felt like every atom of air inside my chest was just it snuffed out. So, experiencing moments like not like that, and not even necessarily bad experiences, like the doing aerial circus and having that like feeling of excitement and adrenaline when you're doing a move in the air. I think all of these can sort of add up to like give us more to draw on in writing.
Yeah, this isn't as fast-paced or exciting as a sport, but I found I've actually gotten a lot of like weird emotional, I don't know what, out of yoga.
Oh, sure.
Like it does that to some people, and it absolutely does it to me. It just like unleashes all the feels every once in a while, and it's kind of weird. It's like you don't understand, where's this coming from? Why is this happening? Why am I crying right now? And it's like,
yoga,
what? Holy shit.
I've experienced that too. Like a good yoga instructor can draw that out of like somehow those stretching the tension out of those joints, and suddenly it all bursts out. It's really kind of a fascinating experience.
Oh yeah, and you just become like hyper aware of like, oh, my feet don't point in the same direction. That's weird. Or like, how come I can bend that way and everybody else can't, but I can't bend this other way that everybody else can? What's going on? Why is my body like this?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's like kind of overwhelming. Yeah. So definitely I'd say about cross-training, because it's so easy if you're just a person who like goes to the gym a few times a week just to, keep your heart functioning. You kind of fall into this routine and you're in this narrow routine and you just get used to it, and it's very unconscious. You put on a podcast and you hit the treadmill and then time passes and then you're done.
Which is great, and that's very healthy, but like in terms of being able to like draw on that for writing, it's going to be a pretty narrow set of experiences just by its nature.
Yeah, definitely. So that's a good idea. Now, beyond writing, do you think this kind of disembodied sense of consciousness can hurt us in other ways?
I would hesitate to say yes to that, just because I've known people who are some of the clumsiest, most unathletic people who could just not pick up like any new physical skill was just like completely beyond them. And some of those people were also some of the like smartest and kindest and most competent people I've known. And so I don't know. I don't think I would say a disconnection from our physical awareness is like, a character flaw in some way, or would prevent anybody from living life to the fullest and the most amazing extent. It might be frustrating if you're like going bowling with your friends or something, but like other than that. And, as much as we've talked about experiencing things and how, great that is, like everybody can reach for something at the edge of their physical comfort or physical boundaries to experience, or experience things through fiction as well, or through talking to people and listening and like reading nonfiction and stuff. And I feel like I would say that the human experience is so rich and has so many ways it can become richer, no matter whether, that's something that comes naturally to a person or not. And I'd say the only place that, where it's really important or, would be hurtful if we don't train up our awareness of our place in space is something like driving, where it could endanger other people if we're not like having an awareness of where we are in time and space. Right. But other than that, I think it's generally part of the tapestry of humanity. Some people are a little more plugged into it, some people aren't, and I think that's fine.
Do you have any writers or stories you'd really recommend who handle like physical writing really well? Like Stephen Mazur, I think I asked him something similar to that. He's the assistant editor at FSF.
Oh yeah, I know Stephen.
He recommended writing from before the era of movies and TV. He felt like action scenes just have a different feel to them and they're less visually centered. But are there writers, particularly like contemporary ones, who you think handle like this physicality, whether it's through like action, whether it's through, I don't know, whether it's through like love scenes or something, just like incredibly well?
I'm curious now about what Stephen said, because I have never tried to look at that, and I'm curious to like look back and kind of survey books from before movies and television and see what I think of their action scenes. But anyway, let's see. The first author who comes to mind is Yoon Ha Lee, who is an amazing author, and he's a fencer. Oh, wow. And he has fencing scenes. His fencing scenes in his Machineries of Empire series are like absolutely phenomenally good. But other than that, he has a lot of like physicality of his characters. Without giving too much away, there's this sort of like, a big part of the series is like one character embodying another, sort of. I don't know if that's the right way to phrase it, but characters who are sharing a body, basically. And
oh wow,
there's a lot of description that's very visceral, I feel, with that, in ways that are very gripping to read. I would also say Charlie Jane Anders is one of my favorite authors, and her, not just physicality, but her descriptions of, and I can't remember off the top of my head like a phrase that she might have used that really impressed me, but the thing we were talking about before of the sort of more intimate senses and not just describing what things look like or sound like, I feel like she does this thing with metaphor that I've really noticed reading her writing, where it makes you feel what the character's feeling in this really unexpected way, and a really holistic and unexpected, and that feels like it describes it perfectly, even if you would never think to describe it with that kind of metaphor. She's just a brilliantly talented writer in all ways. I think also in the short story realm, there's quite a lot of, I feel like I've read so many short stories that do physicality well, but it's kind of hard for me to think off the top of my head. I know J.Y. Neon Young did a body, sort of a body swap story. If memory serves, it was like buying a body from a different person or something like that. That I remember having just a like really incredible, like, again, that sort of visceral awareness of bodies and stuff, and I feel like I've read quite a lot of short fiction that does this very well as well. And those authors for sure, and I'm sure there are so many more.
Right. Okay, well, thank you very much. Now, before we go, where can we find your work? How can our listeners support your work?
My main series is the Cass Russell series. It begins with the sci-fi thriller Zero Sum Game, which is about an anti-heroine who can do math really, really fast, and she uses it to kill a lot of people. You know, maybe more people than she should. Yes, they're full of action. They're very fast-paced. Zero Sum Game, Null Set, and then Critical Point, the third book, is coming out in April, and they are available wherever books are sold. And then I have another book coming out later this year called Burning Roses, which is a fairy tale remix. It's a mix of Red Riding Hood and Beauty and the Beast and a bunch of Chinese mythology and folklore, the legend of Ho Yi the Archer, and all sort of mixed together. So Red Riding Hood and Ho Yi are two middle-aged queer women who are going on adventures together and angsting about their families, and Red Riding Hood is like an expert with a rifle, and Ho Yi is, of course, an archer. And so basically, like, queer women shooting at things, which is maybe my brand.
Oh, fun.
But yeah, I think it's going to be, I'm really excited about that.
Yeah, that sounds awesome.
But that also will be available wherever books are sold. And you can keep up with any of this by going to my website, www.slhuang.com. And I'm also on Twitter at SL_Huang. Again, that's HUANG. And those are the places that it's easiest to see what I'm up to.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. That was a really you had a lot of really interesting stuff to talk about.
Oh, I'm glad. Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, this was a lot of fun.
Yeah, that was great. Okay, so I think I'm going to wrap it up. That is all for this episode. If you like what you heard, head on over to patreon.com/writegood and support us. Subscribers get early access to regular episodes, plus you can join the Discord where you can suggest episode ideas. Book Club tier members get access to monthly bonus episodes where we talk in depth about notable works of fiction. And join us next time when we talk about writing your own story, instead of waiting for someone else to write it for you. Until then, keep writing good.
kittysneezes.com in color.